Let's not go 2 hours too long or whatever, because it is bedtime soon.
Hey, welcome to Popcast, the crowd-sponsored yo-yo show. My name is Doc Pop. Huge shout out to John Anderson and Tucker from Spin Gear and the rest of my sponsors on patreon.com/DocPop. This episode, we're going to dive into some yo-yo history. I've been enjoying these oral history of yo-yo tricks series that I've been doing. So once again, I've got two of my favorite yo-yo historians joining me, Josh E. and Connor Scholten. Josh E. is the 2017 5A champion and a co-founder of Not Creators. Josh, how are you doing today?
Doing really good. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, dude. And I think it's very important, Josh, before we get started, what is the name of the dog we will occasionally see in the background?
The dog that kind of making her way back and forth, that's Rika. So you'll
Rika,
probably see
thank
her
you very
coming
much
in
for yeah, very important. I know people will be very angry if we don't address that. Oh, Rika, it's a Rika spot. Okay, I'm not going to do that every time.
The dog's going to wear your national title medal as well.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And also joining is Connor Scholten, the 2017 2A competition winner, as well as 2018, right?
Yep. US Nats 17 and 18. So.
And we may have seen you from yotricks.com, as well as like you are all over yo-yoing. I think that I remember hearing an interview where your name was mentioned as like a freestyle coach helping yo-yo players out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's kind of a teaching thing. Is I've always had my yo-yo avenue, and then everybody is their own person outside of yo-yoing, right? So yeah, if you take away yo-yoing, what's left of me is I end up being the teacher. So I will tutor people in mathematics. I was a calculus instructor before, substitute teacher. All sorts of different, avenues of teaching. Just wasn't an actual bona fide certified teacher. And so that kind of realm taught me all these different skills about communicating, consulting, explaining things to people. And so that just naturally started to translate over to yo-yoing and, working with yo tricks with the nice blue background. I know it's a slightly different color tonight, but it's always been good to brush up on my skills, because I like to learn through teaching. So I will try to teach a person that, and I go, oh, wait a minute, this stuff could apply to me in this and this avenue, right? And so I've been mentoring and coaching people in my spare time for at least the last decade now. And so I've worked with many great champions. National title winners, a world title winner, and then most recently, some of you may have heard of this new guy named Gavin Hubner, who did pretty well at U.S. Nationals. He and I worked together a month before U.S. Nationals last month in June, and so that was kind of a fun finish to be able to work with him for such a short time and have that good of a result that quick. So.
And if people are interested in learning more about Gavin Hubner, he was just on the Kill Your Yo-Yo podcast. Check that out, and you can kind of hear about how Connor helped him work on his freestyle. Now, the last episode we did together, the three of us, we talked about the oral history of slack tricks. And I think that turned out fantastic, and I'm really excited about this episode. Before we do, though, I've got a little addendum. Spencer Berry, who we mentioned several times in the oral history of slack tricks, and we may or may not mention this episode. He gives us 5 cents every time we mention his name. Spencer Berry left a note on the YouTube channel for the Slack history, and he says, first off, Connor, I'm sorry that I gave you ableist and unsolicited pinch feedback on your breath tutorial. This is talking about how specifically Spencer Berry. Yeah, Spencer Berry, as noted in the last time, was very specific about how you use your thumb. And so he says, he's sorry about that. The thumb butt pinch, which was also my nickname in high school, is a stupid technicality that I was caught up on for a long time, kind of like the make a loop before you catch it definition of the laceration. I need to retire my illusions of control. Now, aside from that apology, he also said, in regards to the history of Slack video, that we left out a trick. Josh, I think you already know what that trick is. Connor, can you guess what trick we left out of the history of Slack?
Oh, goodness. We mentioned slack trapeze maybe, or
You're not going to guess this one. I'm going to tell you.
no,
Spaghetti.
spaghetti. Oh my goodness.
Like,
You're
Oh,
right. You're right.
like
Oh,
the
oh,
slack
such a
trick.
classic.
And I think that's actually kind of interesting because I have a feeling with today's topic we're going to have a couple of those. How did you not think about this? Whatever. Today we are going to deep dive into the oral history of the bind. And when I say the oral history, this is just the lore that's been passed around. We are going to do our best to reference anything that we mention. We're going to have like a link to a video if we can. And I'm kind of thinking for the most part, even though it is the oral history of bind, if it's not on video, I kind of don't care about it. Like if someone's telling me like, oh, I saw this back in 96 or whatever, fine. Show me a video anywhere of it being done. Right. So, but that being said, we are probably missing a lot of stuff, which is where the oral history part comes in. Cause this is just all that, like there might be footage somewhere that we just missed. And I also want to say, this is probably going to be very, American centric because I'm sure, a lot of other places were doing, had their own series of binds and things like that. And this was right before internet video. So like things really could have happened on their own. And we're going to talk about that. And we did our best to kind of research all these different places. First off, I think a good starting point, I mean, what we want to talk about is, hopefully who created the first bind? What was the first production yo-yo with a bind? What was the first freestyle contest that had a bind in it, like first freestyle performance? Yeah, I think those are kind of like the main questions. Oh, how long did it take for the rest of the community to kind of embrace binds after it started? I keep saying bind. Connor, I think you are the perfect person to help explain bind. Why don't you tell us what a bind is?
So the concept of a bind is going to be you have your usual yo-yo, right? And because we're talking history, I had to go classic here. Good old Super Yo Renegade. So you're going to throw down, and of course, when you flick your hand or do something with the string where it gives it a little bit of slack, it's going to make the yo-yo respond and then wind itself back up to your hand, right? And so we would say we're calling the yo-yo back, or we are doing what's called a tug return to get the yo-yo back, right? And that is due to all the friction between the string and the yo-yo. And so the concept of a bind is then going to be, all right, take away that friction between the string and the yo-yo. Now that yo-yo isn't going to respond, meaning it's not going to wind itself back up when you try to call or tug it back, right? And so you'll have a yo-yo spinning, you'll pull on it as much as possible, but because the yo-yo gap is so wide and you see the string isn't able to touch either side of the yo-yo and not touch the sticky substance on the side, you won't be able to pull it back. So in order to get it to come back up, you're going to need to feed some string into the yo-yo, put it into the gap of the yo-yo, and eventually you'll see some string wrap around the inside of the yo-yo, and that will touch the sticky substance, and that's what will make it come back up. The act of putting string into the gap of the yo-yo while you're in a mount is called a bind.
And I think for the sake of this video, we're going to talk about two types of binds, the backspin bind and the front spin bind. And throughout the history of binds, these might have been called different things. And for a large part of that history, including where we are now, they're not really called either of those because we just think of the bind as the backspin bind. Josh, do you want to take a stab at explaining, backspin versus front spin?
Basically, with binds, you have, like you were saying, you really have two kinds of binds. And the first bind that most people usually learn, at least in today's current modern yo-yo world, is what would be a backspin bind. So if I throw a front throw, I'm going to be binding the yo-yo, and I'm going to use my string here, and it's actually going to go into the gap of the yo-yo with this, or against the spin of the yo-yo. Whereas another kind of bind would be if I was doing a side throw, I'm going to be using the slack of the string to actually go into the spin of the yo-yo. And this is where usually in like a trapeze, you'll get that kind of bind. So there's really just the two kinds. One going with the spin of the yo-yo into the gap of the yo-yo, and the other one's going against the spin of the yo-yo. And usually the one that's going against the spin of the yo-yo is the one that ends up being a cleaner finish.
I think it was in the bind theory video, the Yotrix bind theory video. I heard some explanation that sort of helped me out a little bit. It said basically a backspin bind is a bind on the opposite side of the string that you would usually be using for a trick, or something like that. So if you are on a trapeze, you're usually kind of like on, you're usually on the top part of the string. So the front spin bind would be binding from here, which is kind of just like throwing in this wrap or whatever and binding from there. But to do a backspin bind, the trapeze is where we land because that's a safe spot. It doesn't grab. That's the whole point of kind of doing that. And it's the whole point of binding is to make it grab. So the backspin in that case is just the opposite side of where you would normally do your tricks. And that's not a technical thing, because sometimes you could do tricks on the other side of the string. But just in general, when you're doing front style, you tend to be kind of in brain twister. And when you do a bind, you want to be on the opposite side of that brain twister, like a backwards brain twister. And when you're doing a trapeze, you kind of want to be on top of the string. And when you do a bind, you want to do the bottom. Connor did, you worked on that episode. Like, did I get that right?
Yeah, so that one, that bind theory video, by the way, huge undertaking, probably the biggest research project at Yotrix, period. So I initially pitched the idea for that video 2 years before it came out, and we were working on it solid, like for 2 years straight before it came out. So a lot of this was just coming down to, okay, I got to figure this out. We got to make sure we can get this to come out correctly. And so in terms of describing like why backspin will be better, as we mentioned in the video, the idea is, well, if you're in a trapeze, it's going to depend on which way the spin of the yo-yo is going. So we call this part of the bind the tail. So the loop where the end of the string is a part of the loop, we call that the tail of the bind, right? And so we will take the loop of the tail, pinch it, lift your hands up in opposite directions to shorten the length of the tail while you're pinching it, and that's what will get it to activate, right? But if I make the yo-yo spin the other way in the trapeze, and then I shorten the tail this way, it's not going to work because I'm trying to feed the string in by the opposite way the yo-yo is spinning. So instead of the string trying to get into the gap of the yo-yo is trying to spit the string back out. Because it's going against the spin of the yo-yo when you feed the string into it. However, if you make the yo-yo spin the opposite way, now it's going to agree with your spin. The classic way to do that is, okay, start with a regular trapeze on a regular throw. That will be a front spin, because if you grab the tail, pinch it, and shorten it, you'll feed the string into it, but nothing will happen because the spin of the yo-yo is trying to spit it back out. But as soon as you throw a trapeze with a front style throw instead of a side style throw, the spin is now going the opposite direction of what you're normally used to. Now when you shorten the tail, it's going to feed into the string, and since the yo-yo is spinning the other way, it's now going to eat up the string instead of spit out the string.
We've talked about what a bind is, and we've talked about the front spin bind and the back spin bind. I, for a long time, used the term correct and wrong, and I always wanted to do quotes.
Right, yeah.
But when binds first came around, which, I remember seeing them, 2001 World Yo-Yo Contest or National, no, I guess World Yo-Yo Contest, when binds first kind of became something I saw, I was a judge, and it was like a 50-50 chance when you did the front spin bind, which I called the incorrect bind. When you do it, there's a 50-50 chance that thing is not going to, when you throw it, it's going to have a knot in it. And it might not even bind. It's just really not as good as that backspin bind. But in the early days of throwing, of binds, that was the bind people did. And it was, for some people, it was a last resort. Like I heard about Matt Harlow at the Midwest Regional Yo-Yo Contest in, they say 99. We don't have footage of this, but I've heard anecdotally a judge say that Matt was doing his compulsories to get into the freestyle, and at one of the tricks he did a bind at the end, and Dave Scholten had to like call the head judge over to see like, hey, can we accept this if it's a bind? And I think for my case, like in terms of if it counts as a miss or not, I just waited to see what happened. If you threw it and it came out like I was kind of fine with it, and if you threw it and it was a mess, It was probably one deduction for that, and then if you changed your yo-yo, it was like I think 2 clicks or something. And I hated binds. Do either of y'all remember like the first time you saw it? Like Josh, do you remember the first time you saw a bind?
Yeah, I can recall. I think one of the earliest binds I had seen was like a freestyle video, probably around that period of like 2001. I'm thinking it was one of the freestyles in the World Yo-Yo Contest, and I can't remember exactly which player it was, but I do remember seeing a player do a bind, and I remember kind of thinking at the time I was still using very responsive yo-yos, so for me seeing that was like, oh, like why would you need to do that? I feel like that would just be like a risk to do, because like you said, you throw it out again, it's like a pretty good chance you're going to just have a knot in your string. So that's my earliest recollection that I can recall of seeing a bind. It was probably around that 2001 period.
Connor, were you a fan of binds in the beginning?
Oh goodness, because I started in '97 and was off and on for a while there. Like, for when people ask me like how did I get started in yo-yoing, it's usually like a 3-pronged story for me. So like I had my start as a 7-year-old, and then like, okay, played with it for a couple months, put it away. Then I had another event that made me think about it again. Then another event happened. So it was actually on my 3rd trip back into getting interested in yo-yoing was when I met. I actually never saw a bind before. I heard about it first. So it was a pure coincidence that this happened. I think it was like 2001 or 2002. I was on, it probably would have been 2002. I was on spring break from school and traveled to Indianapolis. And then one of the stops that my family trip went on was to the Indianapolis Children's Museum. And as soon as you walk in there, there is a certain man by the name of Takeshi Kamasato standing right next to the gift shop doing yo-yo demonstration. And so because it was like my 3rd trip getting back into yo-yoing, I already knew a little bit. So I like, okay, let me show you a couple tricks, Takeshi. I can do Brain Twister. I can do some of these, basic combos. And that's when I realized, oh, this museum thing is fun and all, but this guy is going to really show me something that I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. And so, like, I talked with Takeshi for probably a solid hour as, like, this 6th grader. And he's telling me all about this whole new world of yo-yoing. He introduced me to the yo-yo world on the internet, told me about Sector Y and Glass Lab, and then he mentioned it casually, and it's like, have you heard about these newfangled things called an unresponsive yo-yo with a bind? And it's like, he couldn't do them at the time, but he told me about it, and he's like, have you even heard about yo-yo not coming back? I'm like, huh? I had no concept of it whatsoever. And so it wasn't until like I started perusing around the internet and discovered it. I think it was like one of the World Yo-Yo Contest videos on Sector Y was when I like first actually saw it. So
like I said, it was a few years of me just, when I saw a bind, just kind of like hoping it would come out on a throw. I want to give a shout out to Dave Poiser, who at the Midwest Regional in 2003 showed me the bind that changed my mind. This was the bind that took it from like I was not anti-bind. I didn't want I got into yo-yoing when ball bearings came around, and I remember when the old school players were like, well, if you can't do that on a wooden yo-yo, I don't care, right? I remember the snotty kind of attitude. So I didn't want to be like just yo-yoing for like a year or two and then like already snotty about the new thing happening. But it wasn't my thing. And I'm going to show you the bind that Poiser showed me. I'm going to try to show it here.
Yeah, this is that's a classic. As soon as you put a bearing on, it's considered cheating, right? Yeah. The classic bind.
So like even the bind before that, which I didn't know was the backspin bind. We didn't have words for that yet. But even this was sort of like boop, boop. It was like a 2-step thing. And Poiser just went boom, boom. It was almost like a trick itself. It was so smooth. I saw that. I didn't even. He was like, "Hey, Doc, let me show you a trick." I don't even remember what the trick was. I just remember that bind. It blew my mind, and I went from like anti-bind to a bind ambassador. I even, was teaching some of the masters. I won't name them, but some of the masters that were kind of crapping on binds for a while and, really fighting against them. One of them, in Florida at Worlds came up to me and said, "Hey Doc, can you teach me how to bind?" And I was like, yes, let's do this. And I taught him that move. And he was like, after that, he smiled so big and he was so happy. And he was like me, he'd been converted finally. So huge shout out to, Dave Poiser. The Poiser bind is not the first of these. It's many years late, but it was the first one that I saw that finally made me go, "Oh, that's stylish." And that's really, really clear. So I want to talk about that one. Yeah. I want to talk about, because, we mentioned eating spaghetti as a slack trick, right? I kind of want to get some of these things out of the way that we're like, that we need to mention. They're not really binds, but we need to mention them. One of the first ones is the trapeze wind, like the classic. A lot of people mention this. It's clearly not a bind, but it does seem in some people's mind to kind of like invoke that bindness. The thing I thought was interesting was, I'll hold up on this for a second because I want to talk about John Gates. John Gates. Let's go back even further. Dale Oliver in 1953 created the Offstring throw, with a wooden butterfly yo-yo, I think. And it was just a novelty trick, and there was no ending to it. The ending was literally just tossing the yo-yo up and catching it and taking your bow because he couldn't get it back onto his hand. The 1993 contest that John Gates was at, yo-yo event that John Gates was at, Dale Oliver taught him this trick just to shut John up, because John was this obnoxious teenager who, was picking up tricks really super fast. And John was given this one task of like learning the Offstring throw just as a way to shut him up, just, because there is no ending to it and it's super hard. So just like, okay, fine, you want to learn something. Dale Oliver showed him this thing. That night, John figured out how to bind the yo-yo and bring it back up. And he was trying to basically do a Diablo elevator. So when you do a Diablo, if you put a wrap around and you pull tight, if the Diablo doesn't have a bearing, the Diablo will climb up. And so, John Gates thought, I'll just try that. I'll just put a wrap around and pull it. And he ended up causing a bind to happen. And he, I don't know how clean it was, but like he realized he could get the yo-yo to come back to his hand. So when we're talking about binds, we have to acknowledge the Offstring bind. And we'll talk about later, how, I guess we could talk about now. Do either of y'all have a thought? Like, did the Offstring bind directly lead to because the main thing I want to find out is who created the 1A bind, the way we use 1A yo-yos.
I think when I consider some of the earliest like Offstring and just like the Offstring bind in general, it's hard to say whether or not it really had much of an influence on the 1A bind necessarily. Obviously, the Offstring bind, especially, for its time, predominantly was done, in spin with the yo-yo. And I think generally what we see is that for the 1A bind, it's kind of the same, where it was usually, from a trapeze and then pretty much like wrapped into the spin of the yo-yo. And in a similar way, the Offstring bind was done kind of in that same fashion. In terms of whether or not it has a direct influence, it's really hard to say, especially because during the time when we started seeing some of those first binds, it wasn't like all the 1A players were also doing Offstring. I think at the time, Offstring was a pretty niche thing that only a handful of people were really doing, whereas obviously everyone is doing 1A.
Let me mention these other two kind of novelty things. One, it occurred to me while I was doing some research for this episode, and it occurred to me that one of the things that didn't even get mentioned, if we're going to mention the trapeze string wind, which I don't think anyone's here is promoting that was the original bind, but like wrapping a yo-yo, the first thing when you teach people how to yo-yo, the first thing you teach anybody how to yo-yo is put your finger over the gap and make that little string and do that wrap. And in a way that's the first bind we all learned. I'm not saying that is the bind that we're looking for today, right? Because we're talking about how to bring a spinning yo-yo back up. But in a way, just that fundamental thing that we learn is just sort of the original bind. But one of the other tricks that John Gates mentioned is I was asking John, do you think the Offstring bind is what led to the 1A bind? And he said, it's kind of a coincidence. Like it might have been inspired in the same way he was inspired by, even Dale Oliver's throw or Diablo. Like, it's not a direct one-to-one, he doesn't think. However, he mentioned his theory for where binds come from, and it's a trick called the shotgun. Are either of y'all familiar with the shotgun? No? All right, it's old school trick, and it's not great. But the shotgun is backwards mount and shooting the yo-yo forward. This is a little hard to do sitting down. But basically, the shotgun was like, oh, boom, and like the yo-yo shoots forward. This was an old school trick, not like an ending. It was literally just putting it on and trying to get the yo-yo, your wooden yo-yo to just kind of shoot forward. Whoops. And it wasn't used as a bind. It was used as a way to launch the yo-yo forward. Kind of like eating spaghetti. It was a novelty trick that is technically the backspin bind, but I don't think that's that. Now that I've shown that to y'all, have either of y'all seen that trick before? I definitely remember seeing it somewhere, but it's an old school trick.
Yeah, I feel like I had seen like a really old black and white video, like at one point of like, I don't even think it was from the US either. I think it was from a different country, but I do recall that, seeing someone like you were saying, essentially it was just a trick where they used the spin to kind of shoot the yo-yo forward and get it to come back. But yeah, it was very much like a novelty trick. It wasn't like they were using it as a way to specifically for their yo-yo to return.
And in a way, the offstring throw and even the offstring catch, in a way, were kind of novelties at their time. I think even when John Gates had the offstring catch, I don't think he was really he had an offstring freestyle. I think at that point, he just basically had a way to get the yo-yo back to his hand and he could throw it again. But it wasn't maybe until THP Hawaii, John Gates was down there and he taught it to like Sky Kiabu or something, is sort of the creation of the genre or whatever, beyond just kind of the novelty trick that Dale and John Gates had. That's I'm not stating that as a fact. I'm just saying that this trick in a way is kind of a novelty thing, and some of the other tricks that we talk about in the other styles were novelty that eventually became their own things. So I want to get us into contest and players, and I think this is where we're going to really find out who was the first documented, I think, in this section. We've all been doing research. A huge shout out to, I posted on Facebook that we're researching this for a video, and so many people came in and commented. And I think early on, it was obvious to me that just a good barometer for binds in general, not the person who created them, but just kind of a good way to see where binds were for that year, was Yuki Spencer. In 2001, Yuki was doing binds with a freehand that was the grabbiest freehand. If you watch his freestyle from the national, I think it's the National Yo-Yo Contest in 2001, it doesn't look like it needs binds. If anything, it looks like he's really being risky by putting the binds in. It is a super snappy yo-yo. But he is doing binds with a Duncan freehand that's not, we hadn't really maxed out the width of yo-yos yet. We hadn't really thought about him that way. So he's just kind of doing a bind at the end of every trick in 2001, but he's doing the front spin bind for all of his binds. If it's a front style trick or a side style trick, he's still doing front spin binds. So that was 2001. In 2002, he was still using that combo. No, I got that wrong. In 2001, he actually was doing backspin binds on front style tricks. And in researching this, I actually found that was, for some reason, very common. I'm just going to put this out there. It might be because of the shotgun, because it could be that somewhere they just kind of understood that. They didn't understand front and back, but when they were facing this way, they just kind of did. I don't know why, but for some reason we were doing backspin binds kind of collectively in 2001, and in 2002 he did the same thing. All his side style was front spin binds, and all his front tricks were backspin binds. I know that's confusing when I say it that way, but 2003 is where he finally switched everything to backspin. So just using Yuki again as a barometer, it sort of feels like freestyles were, if they were doing binds, which a lot of people were in 2001 and 2002, it wasn't until 2004 that it would kind of clicked that oh, we're doing them wrong, and let's do it this safer way. And even then, I don't think we were doing fancy binds. I think all binds were still sort of like that. You do your trick, and then you awkwardly go in the back and you kind of pull, and it's consistent, but it's, it wasn't like, the trick style binds we do now. How are y'all feeling with that?
That was really like the real barometer, because when you think about it, like Yuki back then was the guy who was always ahead of the curve on everything, right? So there was like that time frame between like 2001 and 2005 and 6-ish, where it's like, okay, everybody's doing these binds that are, like my idea is like the reason they'll go do a backspin bind when they're in front style is because it's actually not that hard to get on the opposite side of the string. Whereas like you come from a trapeze and then get into the undermount, like you actually have to like learn that fishhook method. You know how everybody has trouble like learning that 1.5 mount and like, oh, I can't get it up into the underside of the string and it's really difficult to get it up in there, which is like a testament to like Dave Poiser coming up with that. Oh, let's just feed the throw hand underneath it instead to, circumvent the toughness of getting it onto the other side. So like, I think that was like a real tough part of it was guys had like these yo-yos where they had such low spin at the end of their combos, they just didn't have enough, and like it was actually a huge risk to go from a trapeze to the undermount because you maybe had a couple RPMs left, period, and the sheer act of going for the undermount may make you completely mess up, right? So like that was my theory on why people weren't like gunning for like, okay, let's backspin everything in every mount, right? And so it was slowly like merging between like 2001 to 2005-ish, where people were realizing, oh, okay, we should get on the other side of the string, it feels cleaner. And then as yo-yos became more rim weighted, and like especially when like Yoyojam was coming out with like their hybrid plastic metal models, right? And like you felt like even though there was low spin, you could still go for the undermount without having to really worry if you were going to completely like lose the yo-yo spin, right? And so like you felt more comfortable with going for that undermount while you're inside style and go for the backspin bind. And I kind of remember that transition like slowly moving towards that realm. And yeah, I would say like even in those early 2000 days, like I always remember like it was slow going because all of us were against it, right? Like that's the reason it took a solid few years for us to like fully embrace binds and be like, okay, let's all agree to do this and make this happen, because people who are recent to the sport will not remember like, oh, we had to modify our yo-yos to make them unresponsive. They never came out of the package unresponsive for years, and like it was meant for ease of access for kids to be able to get it to come back up. Otherwise, they would say it's broken, right? And so that would be the customer service 20 years ago. So I mean, there was all of that, and not to mention that Doc said he was against binds. That was actually the consensus back then. I remember like thinking in like 2002 up until like 2005, and I was probably even one of the latest people to like finally get converted. Like I could see myself being like, okay, 2008, 2009, I'm starting to be like, okay, fine, well, we'll all go with this bind thing.
Wow.
Yeah, and like, yeah, I was probably one of the last people to like fully be like, okay, fine, let's go with it. So like, it was a huge thing for everybody in terms of binds, because I mean, the sheer act of going from fixed axle to a bearing was considered cheating. It was like, oh, we're taking all of this skill out of the skill toy, because this thing is now a completely forgiving thing, and like you can do anything on it, feels like, when you make that transition. And so like going from responsive to unresponsive is just an even bigger jump in like, oh, this ease of access thing, right? And so it's like, okay, now this barrier has really taken down, and it's like, okay, do you need any skill at all, is what we were all thinking back then, right? So it was definitely like a huge, overwhelming consensus of, okay, if you have an unresponsive yo-yo and you bind it in a trick, we call that cheating, and we don't even count the trick. Even the early World Yo-Yo Contest days of compulsories, you'll actually find it in the rules. I even updated the Yo-Yo Wiki on that recently, and I think it was like around 2003, 2004-ish, they started realizing, okay, fine, we'll let you guys do a bind return here, right? But back in the day, they were like, okay, no binds allowed on this trick. Like, even, after the Midwest regional thing, like, there were a couple of years in the World Yo-Yo Contest where they were like, you are not allowed to bind or it's considered a miss.
Yeah, so I remember, years ago, the first time I'd ever attempted to go to a contest was California State's 2002. I wasn't able to make it in 2002. I did go in 2003. But I remember leading up to California State's 2002, I had planned to compete in the sports ladder. And in the sports ladder, I remember on the Cal State's website, they had like the list of tricks and they also had rules. And one of the things that at the end of all the like more advanced tricks in the sport ladder, they had a little section at the end that said, in parentheses, no binds allowed. And the earliest I can remember seeing that was from the trick lists for Cal State's 2002. They had it again in 2003. And then in 2004, they actually took it out of the trick ladder. So it could have been before 2002 as well, but from 2002 and 2003, there definitely was a little blurb there after the more advanced tricks that said no binds allowed, and then they took it out by 2004.
So quick question for both of y'all. I'll start with you, Connor. Who would you guess was the first 1A player to use a bind in the World Yo-Yo Contest freestyle?
Oh,
quick
goodness.
Answer.
Quick
One
answer? Oh, man. I'm thinking it would be 2000 Worlds when they were outside in the desert, maybe?
Okay, good guess.
Yeah.
Josh, who are you thinking?
Oh, gosh.
First 1A contestant to use a freestyle bind. World Yo-Yo.
I'm torn. I'm pretty sure it would be 2001. I'm not sure if it would be Kodo Watanabe or Dennis Susser. One or the other.
That was a trick question, y'all.
Okay.
Because in 1999, Offstring was still part of 1A. And Hironori Mi.
And then you're going to say Hironori Mi.
Hironori Mi was the very
go.
first player to ever. Now, that's not what we're looking for. I know that's not where there's a trick question.
that's a
but
good
technically,
trick question.
1A, very first
It was
freestyle 1A.
back then. Yeah.
We talked about Yuki just sort of being an influence and kind of like a good barometer. We talked about Hironori Mi being 1A division before it was kind of separated. Before Yuki in freestyle contest, we saw a lot of binds coming from Japan. Specifically, Koda Watanabe was doing front spin binds in his freestyles. He did one. He actually did a plastic whip at the World Yo-Yo Contest in 2001 and threw it, which was a backspin bind. It's not like we didn't quite understand. I feel like we just didn't we were so naive because I feel like he was doing all the rest this way, but he did this nice bind after that, and it didn't occur to him that it was like a different style. But Koda was using binds in the UTYJ yo-yo competition in Japan, March 2001. In his freestyle, he was doing front spin binds for both his front and side style tricks. So all his binds, unlike Yuki, who we talked about, who was doing backspin on the front. So March 2001 was a pretty early documented use. Koda was so well known for using binds that the technique of binding in Japan was known as Puchan Modoshi. Puchan Modoshi. Which means Koda's yo-yo return technique in English. Poo was Koda's nickname. Huge shout out to Ray Irakawa for sharing that fact with me. So Koda was in Japan sort of seen as the bind pioneer. I do want to mention, though, that at that same contest, March 2001, which I'm assuming, because everyone's saying he'd already had that nickname before that contest, I'm assuming he'd already been doing binds. But at that contest, Black competed. And Black was using a responsive yo-yo, but he did a backspin bind from a front style trick. He was doing some front style combo, and he ended it with a backspin bind. 2001 March. So here in Japan, in March of that year, before most of the American contests had started, we were seeing binds happening, and we actually saw a backspin bind.
Yeah, it gets kind of confusing, right? It's like, that's a classic question I remember having to answer all the time, like after the bind theory video came out, is, can you bind on a responsive yo-yo? And the answer is, well, yes, I just did it. But then again, like part of that trapeze wind-up technique, which I also learned some old VHS tapes, and I think Dennis McBride was most recent VHS tape I saw where it was mentioned. He called it a roller coaster wind-up. Mm-hmm. So that technique there, where it's like okay, you have a yo-yo that's not spinning and you're winding it up. So not only is it feeding string into the gap of the yo-yo, it's actually making the yo-yo start to spin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I think part of the reason, like, you would be doing, say, a backspin bind, even though you had a responsive yo-yo, was because, again, back in the day, you barely had enough spin to complete the trick. And, like, performing that backspin bind helped you feed a little bit more string into the gap and even help accelerate your yo-yo a little bit to get it to spin a little faster, just so, like, you would have enough energy just to get it to come back.
Josh, I want to move. I think we're wrapping up freestyle binds, but before we do, I just want to give you a chance. Is there anything that you think we left out about binding in freestyle competitions?
No, that's the only thing I can think of. I was gonna go back to your question earlier in regards to when you're saying what was the first bind that was done in during 1A at a yo-yo contest. Did you say specifically World Yo-Yo Contest, or did you say just in yo-yo contest in general?
I was trying to say world. If I didn't, my bad. But yeah, I was trying to think specifically of the World Yo-Yo Contest because the 1999 World Yo-Yo Contest is the one I was thinking of.
Okay, got it. I wasn't sure if you had mentioned Worlds because I was also going to mention the champion of 1A for U.S. Nationals 1998 was Sky Kiabu, and in that freestyle, he actually did use a Henry's Viper and did 2 Offstring bind returns on that as well.
Oh, you schooled me, dude. I tried to get you on a trick question. I tried to punk you, and you're like, well,
yeah,
actually.
That's why I don't like. That's why I don't go head to head with Josh too much. I know he's gonna beat me.
Everyone should know Hironori me, but Sky Kiabu is not didn't quite have the staying power like Hironori me is still obviously in yo-yoing and has a yo-yo store, but Sky Kiabu was X Division before X Division was a thing. He was like a one-man X Division. Like, I think he was. I never got to see him perform. I don't think. Well, no, I saw him at Nationals a few years after. But I saw footage of his Nationals routine. I think '98, and it was insane. Offstring and really innovative stuff. He just kind of switched around and did all these different styles in his 1A routine because again, that was before they split the division. So huge shout out to Sky Kiabu. So I want to. I think in my mind, forgetting about the Offstring, I want to put a pin in Kota Watanabe and Black as at least UTYJ. Black might have been the first freestyle player that we see do a backspin bind, and it sounds like Kota was doing front spin binds, but both of those were documented March 2001, and I couldn't find anybody. Like, people kept saying this person. I mean, I heard Matt Harlow did it in a compulsory, but I didn't see any video of him doing it in 98 or 99.
Did or didn't happen, right?
A lot of players in the Facebook thread that I had going were saying Clay Murray, who Clay Murray was in the Kickin' Tricks video. He's got a great smile. He's doing some rad bucket tricks, I believe, in the Kickin' Tricks video. I think he had a lot of bucket tricks. And he was a member of Team Duncan and also on the Duncan How to Be a Player Volume 1 video. And people kept saying, Clay taught it to me in 98. Clay taught it to me in 99. And I keep saying video or it didn't happen. And Jeff Koons watched the How to Be a Player Volume 1 specifically just to research this. Like, I think he just went through his old videos, kind of had an idea of like when binds might have happened, went through his old videos, and he found in How to Be a Player Volume 1, 43 freaking minutes into the video, Clay Murray ends a side style combo with the backspin bind. And it is not like, you also see Steve Brown do a bind in this video, but it is not none of us would be like, that is a bind. Like, that is a bind we would just leave in front of a fire station and hope they take care of it. Like, we would not have anything to do with this bind that Steve Brown has. It's like an accidental thing, and then he hops the yo-yo up and it comes to his hand, and you can tell he's not going to throw that yo-yo again because he knows, we all know. But Clay Murray does the most beautiful backspin bind that you cannot deny is a very clear example of an early bind of any sort, front or backspin. And I reached out to Chris Neff and Mark McBride. Mark McBride shot and edited the show, the video, and Chris Neff was there with him shooting this trick. And they both confirmed that this was shot a week before the National Yo-Yo Contest, which is really interesting because the second oldest version of a bind I could find
I think he said World Yo-Yo Contest of 2000.
Was it World?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gotta look again here.
But I do want to mention that the second oldest bind I can find on video was Sean Curran, who was also in Kickin' Tricks, and does this front style combo where he kind of it's kind of like a boingy boing, but it's just hopping from one string to another. It's not hopping between them. And then he kind of does a couple Lindy loops and throws forward, and it's a sloppy bind. It's not a backspin bind. It's I think a front spin bind, and it's gnarly. He does throw afterwards. It comes out. Oh, but Kickin' Tricks was 99.
I was about to say, Kickin' Tricks.
Yeah, Kickin' Tricks was earlier.
99.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh no! Did y'all see Sean's bind?
Yeah, I know the trick you're talking about. It's the bounce that he does like a kind of like a gunslinger and then shoots it out. Yeah.
Is that a bind?
I think it's a bind, although I don't know if it was completely intentional. Because when I saw him do it, and then immediately he kind of goes into that throw right after, I have a feeling it maybe wasn't supposed to end in such a way. Like, I think naturally, if you're just going to let go of a gunslinger type trick, I know because there's a classic trick in a front throw where you throw it out, and then because it's spinning, with it, it just comes out, and then you're able to catch it or do like a inside loop regeneration. So I don't know if Sean was necessarily trying to do the same thing, and then it came out in that way because it was instead a side throw instead of a front throw. It's kind of hard to say. Like, I definitely know the trick looks a little bit sloppy at the end, but it definitely creates a bind when he catches it for sure.
And he throws it like he knows there's no bind in it, which could have been, he could have rolled those dice. Right. I'm going to try to demonstrate the trick. It's not a hard trick, but I might still be butchering it because anyway, as I recall, he does this and then just hops from string to string. So not going between them. And then he hinds back, I think, on the split bottom mount. And he does, I believe, roll, throw or something. I think he actually unrolled the other way. But it's, and this I can tell you right now is going to be, man. But yeah, I think he might have done this. And, boy, Josh, that's interesting. We don't know if Sean intended to bind or not.
Yeah, I really quickly had the video pull up too. He actually does it from a side throw. So it's not from a front throw and a split bottom. He actually does it from a side throw, and then he gets into this kind of almost 1.5 kind of mount, and then that's where he hops the strings and then does the gunslinger out.
I'm watching it. Oh, you're right. Side throw. So does that change? Is that actually a backspin bind? I mean, it looks on purpose. It looks on purpose to me. Connor, you've got a link. You're the tiebreaker here for the history, because that's how history works, right? You have three.
or like the thumbs up, thumbs down thing, just like every single movie, right? Like I saw Dodgeball recently, where Chuck Norris was the deciding vote.
It was crystal clear in my mind that it was Clay, and I hate that I was thinking that was the same year as Kicking Tricks, because this is messy.
There's the link. All right, I'm about to look at it here. Okay, yep, side style throw. He's hitting there, doing trampoline. Okay. Yeah, so he is he's in a keychain mount, or that would be gunslinger if it was front style, but it's spinning the other way. So that would be a backspin mount. And that's the other thing that I would like to know too, is I would probably keep looking through the video, because I'm pretty sure he does something else in the video too, right?
He appears.
Oh no, yeah, okay. So right after he does it, he does a throw down and catch, and I can see how responsive it is. So I mean, that thing is like incredibly responsive. Like if you give that thing half a centimeter, that thing is going to come back up. Like that's how responsive he is right now. But it's really hard to tell, because like it's in the middle of a transition right before he does it.
So is it on purpose or not?
I'm gonna say no. I need it to be like he needs to have something in his finger, or he intends to like keep the keep the tail of the bind to stay in a certain way and pull on it. But that seems like one of those, he just throws it out, and because it's responsive, he knows no matter what happens, it's coming back.
Yeah.
So
I mean, when you look at Clay's version, Clay, it's a backspin. He knows exactly what he's doing. It goes on the back, and then he does it. It's so obvious, and here it's
very
not
deliberate.
obvious.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, all right. So.
Yeah, it does bind. But, yeah, I don't know. We got to play the intent game, though, I don't know. I'm going to say no if I had to, if you pointed something at me and said you have to decide right now. I'm going to say no, but I still, don't feel... I still don't feel great about that stance.
It's very rocky, yeah.
You could convince me to go the other way if you had a good argument.
Well, I think that's going to be the vibe of all of our answers are going to be very gray, especially when we get into... No, I don't think especially. I think throughout the whole thing. But when we get into the yo-yos that were designed for this or whatever, it is going to get super freaking murky. So just, put on your life vest, be ready to paddle a little bit. Before we get into that, Josh, you sent a video... of Clay Murray doing Mission Tortilla chips, which was posted on this YouTube channel, Connor Scholten. I don't know.
That was just another early example I could find of Clay Murray doing a bind. So, kind of when I thought about some of the first people I'd ever seen doing binds, Clay Murray's bind from the Kick and Tricks video was one of the first ones that came up. And then also there was a variety of videos that came out from Sector Y, all from Nationals 2000. And all the tricks that he had in that, he would always end in a bind, which is interesting because in How to Be a Player, he had tricks that ended in a bind, like the last one that you're thinking of, but he actually had earlier tricks where he wasn't doing a bind. So it was interesting to see that from this period when he was filming with How to Be a Player and then into Nationals 2000, which apparently was just the week after. He all his tricks were using a bind. Yeah,
the one on my YouTube channel is definitely backspin. So he does throw a breakaway, but he's throwing it off to the side and then facing the camera the other way.
Right.
And so it feels like he feels like he's in a front style, and then he's going to throw it into the gap like it's a front style front spin bind, but he's throwing the other way, breakaway into it. So the yo-yo is spinning the other way. So as soon as you switch the spin of the yo-yo, everything front spin becomes back spin and vice versa. So even though it looks like it, because of the yo-yo spin the other way, automatic backspin.
So I feel like we've talked about freestyles and usage of binds in freestyles. We've talked about earlier documented recordings of them before they were seen in freestyles. And near the end, we can kind of recap on our opinions of who did what. I think the last thing for us to talk about, is yo-yos. And I do want to talk about, what was the first yo-yo that was manufactured with it was sold as an unresponsive yo-yo, or was definitely in some way, whatever terminology they used, if it was different than what we used, it was designed not for tug response. But before we get into that, I feel like we have to talk about mods, and this is where things get really blurry. And honestly, I'm not really cared about I'm not that interested in the first person who modded a yo-yo for unresponsive, because I think it'd be easier to put a date on first manufactured. But as far as mods go, we were all modding our yo-yos. If you were a 2A player who wanted a more responsive yo-yo, you were crushing them shims, those plastic shims. If whatever you were doing, you were modding your yo-yos back in the day. No production yo-yo was great for what you wanted. All of them needed some work, and some of them were even designed knowing you'd have to put work into them. And there, I'm kind of specifically thinking of Yoyojam.
Josh, do you have a throw monkey that's modded just like me, and you have it ready to go? Oh, okay. No, I was like, yeah, I got my mods from old school days sitting right here, so I'm ready to show them off too.
Yeah, no, I'm going too slow. Let's talk about your mod, Connor, and Josh, you have one too. But Connor, show us what you got there.
So this is actually something I got in the mail recently. There's a for those who like to go into the niche world. I found a European website that still had a bunch of old yo-yos still in stock that have been sitting on a shelf for 15, 20 years. And one of them happened to be Modfather, or Perry Prine, man of Duncan. He came around and was selling a whole bunch of recess mods. So that's Perry Prine taking the drill bit and then drilling this hole and then filling it with flowable silicone right here. And so that was a classic mod all of us had to do back in the day. And so like the silicone mod, I remember like being something that really came into popularity around 2005. And then before that, the concept of taking the drill bit and like taking out some chunks of plastic just so you could take the response system away from the string. That concept is the recess sticker mod, and I very much remember because one of the people who got me started was Takeshi Kamasato. We started emailing after I first met him, and he got me into online yo-yoing. He started like telling me about this idea of the recess mod in an email way back in the day, back when he first came up with it, and that was around 2002. And then, lo and behold, a few videos came out where people were like, wow, this is not just an unresponsive yo-yo, where it's like, okay, there's still like a slight chance that it will respond and your will come back, right? Like we had really small gaps back in the day. But this is like the first mod where it was like, oh, snap, I got the ability to do all of these different string tricks, and I feel good that it's not going to like accidentally bite and then hit me in the knuckles. And yet it will still come back to my hand, and like I can pull on the string and just like tug on it as hard as possible, and like this thing isn't going to budge, right? And so like you felt like you still had good traction and like you had a good bind and a tight bind when it came back. So that was a thing back in the day where it was like you want something that was forgiving on the string and came back with a tight bind. And the recess mod was like one of the first mods where that was really a thing that balanced the two worlds and said, okay, we don't need a trade-off here. We can make both of them good at the same time.
So it sounds like in 2005-ish, yo-yos still were being designed to be as unresponsive as possible while still being responsive, because otherwise we wouldn't have needed that mod. That's what it sounds like. Josh, do you want to talk about mods? You have the same thing. You can say the same exact things Connor did, or add anything you want.
Yeah. So I mean, I took out two of these actually for different reasons. So this was actually a Spintastics Tiger Shark with rubber rims that are glued onto it, but inside there's actually it uses a beefcake bearing, so two bearings. You know, the gap on the Tiger Shark is pretty thin, so if you were able to put two bearings side by side, you'd essentially get a wider gap, and that was something that a lot of players did in the early days. Not necessarily to require the yo-yo to have a to bind to come back, because this yo-yo does not need a bind. It just kind of opened the gap up a little bit, so you'd have a little bit more like freedom of motion where you're doing string tricks. But another yo-yo that came to mind that I wanted to bring up was Spintastics made the Great White Shark. In 2001, they released this. And this was an interesting yo-yo too, because also it was essentially a tiger shark, and it had a beefcake inside. So there's the two bearings inside. The gap was really wide, and I remember Spintastics they weren't necessarily calling it an unresponsive yo-yo, but they were marketing this yo-yo, all the way back in 2001 as a yo-yo that was supposed to be like, I guess, semi-responsive, where, well, it would still be able to be tug responsive. Because the gap was much wider, you were able to do string tricks a lot easier. And it's kind of a weird mix because, like, it does come back, with the tug response, but if you bind it like usual, it's not going to be like the older yo-yos where it gets all snagged up on the inside. So, like, this being a yo-yo from 2001 is kind of a interesting turning point where I kind of see it like they were kind of getting into the territory of unresponsive, but it was still like kind of hanging on to responsive yo-yos at that time too.
I think no yo-yo company wanted to manufacture a yo-yo that didn't come back up to your hand. I could be wrong. Like, I think that they just thought that was sacrilegious. it could be that we just didn't have the terminology, so we didn't know to design around that. Because if you don't have the way of expressing it, then no one's going to be able to design around it or whatever. We're just kind of thinking these loose thoughts.
I do remember like a few conversations, like back in the day, like all of us were talking on the yoyoing.com forum, right? And like we didn't have text messaging or Facebook. Like this is the only place yo-yoers could like, communicate, across the country and world, right? And so like that was where like everyone was talking. And I remember like people were talking about their theory of, okay, when is unresponsive going to come out? And like the overwhelming consensus I remember reading back in the day was guys were saying, well, we need to market to everybody, right? And so our target market is to these beginners. And back in the day, it's like it's considered sacrilegious for a beginner to start on an unresponsive yo-yo back in the day because it was considered bad form, right? And like, I'm an old school guy, so like I still will like be like, okay, here's a responsive yo-yo, boy. Like, go ahead. Like I'll make them start in a responsive yo-yo because I still can't let go of the past, right? But like that was always a thing back in the day of like, okay, everyone had that consensus of no person should start with an unresponsive yo-yo because it's the concept of a bind. We didn't have any way to teach it because no one really knew what the bind was doing or how it worked or anything like that. And so like back in the day, it was like, okay, what's your target audience? Well, you want it to be as many people as possible. And most of the people in the world that play with a yo-yo like need it to be a responsive yo-yo so they can get it back to their hand. Otherwise, they're going to, call up customer service and say, this yo-yo is broken, it doesn't come back, right? So like the concept of, okay, let's make it be broken on purpose out of the package was just a strange idea to everyone. So like it took a while before somebody decided to like, oh, okay, like I think there's enough people that can do unresponsive where we can try this, right?
I think what you're saying, Connor, about why sell a broken yo-yo, like we were breaking our yo-yos, is how they were thought of it. We mentioned the Beefcake. In doing this research, and I've seen other people ask this question before, where did binds start from? I keep seeing things that I think are wrong. Like, first off, one of the things I see people say is slack tricks gave birth to binds, which I disagree with because in my mind, a slack you can pinch, so you can kind of like it's not like a laceration or a finger spin or like a grind. You don't have to have slack to do slack. You don't have to have anyway. That's a different matter. The other thing people say is beefcaking gave birth to binds. Like binds came out of beefcaking. And y'all know me. Connor, you know me?
Yeah, I have to do my research, right? Because when it comes to trivia, like if you know your yo-yo trivia and you don't know Doc Pop, then you don't know your yo-yo trivia, right?
Yeah, the one thing people know is that I am always happy to take credit for shit. And I don't think the Beefcake had anything to do with binding, or at least I didn't used to before starting this. Beefcaking is a style of mod that I created in 1999. I used it in my 1999 World Yo-Yo contest, and I was not binding. As I said earlier, I didn't start binding until 2003. So that's why I've always been like, the beefcaking and binding are two different things, because in my mind, it took me 4 years before I started binding. And beefcaking was born out of the Viper bearing, which I don't know if this is visible at all. This is 2.5 millimeters. It is super small, smaller than an A bearing, which is pretty common, and more than half the size of a C bearing, your common C bearing. So the Vipers, I don't know why I was using Vipers, but for some reason I was using Vipers, and there was a kit with shims. This is a tiny little shim, and you could shim these things as much as you want. It doesn't matter, because the most width you will ever get if you shim it is this. It does not matter how many shims you have, because eventually you'll over shim it and then you're just on the side. So somewhere I figured out, oh crap, a bearing in there with no shims and another bearing, and then shim the crap out of it. And now you've got like effectively what is a C bearing, which even then this other bearing is halfway in there, and it's already, so I'm just getting a little bit more. So it's not even a C bearing gap, but this was the early mod of the Beefcake. And you can see I still had like a friction sticker on it, and this I took to an engraving, like a trophy store, and I had them like I wanted them to engrave the starburst in there. And they were like, we charge by the word. And I was like, my word is ooh. Can you spell that? Yeah, it's 12 zeros. Just 12 O's. That's my one word. So I had this engraved at the Mall of America, and just had 2 bearings in there, which you couldn't even do with later Vipers.
Was this at air traffic, by the way, or?
Yeah. I mean, this would have been before that's why I was doing it. I was working for Air Traffic. Air Traffic was the U.S. distributor of Henry's. I was working for them in 99, I guess, because they sent me to the World Yo-Yo Contest. So, yeah, that's the reason why I was like, I have to figure out how to make this yo-yo work. And this is super snappy. This is super, super, super snappy. This is not a bind return yo-yo. However, it's possible that this yo-yo, this design, made us think yo-yos could be wider. Someone said, Josh, you said 2001. I found on a website a great white shark, the Beefcake tiger shark. I saw one from 2000, I think, but I think you might be right. My info could have been wrong. But yeah, these things could have slowly given birth to the C bearing. At the very least, they probably gave birth to the concave bearing that Frank Diffio used, where Frank was still taking A bearings or like smaller bearings, not this small, and he was actually putting a groove in the center to recreate something kind of like this. I don't know if you knew it or not, but like something that kind of keep the string centered, where these 2 bearings tend to have the string centered.
Yeah, for those of you guys who don't know, like when Doc was doing the Beefcake thing, like as it gained popularity, people were calling it the poor man's concave because that little groove between the 2 bearings kept it center.
String centering technology, yep.
and so I just want to say that beefcaking, I don't think binds came out of beefcaking. It's possible in this gray murky area that beefcaking inspired people to do C's or concaves or whatever, and eventually we got yo-yos wide enough to bind. But like I said, I wasn't binding for like 4 years after doing this. So like in my mind, they're kind of unrelated, but, I want to move on. I know I'm taking a long time here. Frank Diffio, he is one of the first factories, who kind of started catering towards unresponsive play, less responsive. I guess I want to say less responsive. And he started off with diff pads, which were like Duncan friction stickers. But when Duncan friction stickers wore out, they kind of had this sweet spot where they weren't super grabby, but they weren't just a fabric underneath them or plastic underneath them. And Frank found a material that he could cut the exact same shape. So you could take your Duncan stickers out and you could put these in. You could use them as replacements, or you could use them as less responsive. And you could also put in his wide C bearing, or his concaved A bearing. I guess for a freehand, it would have been that. And that was 2002 that he was doing that. And again, he wasn't designing these specifically for unresponsive bind return. This was all of us slowly moving from one style to another. It wasn't like an overnight shift. And he was kind of that middle of the Beefcake was kind of that middle. He was one of the first factories to kind of start making stuff like that. And I had thought, one of the first production run unresponsive yo-yos that a lot of people mention is after Frank came out with the concave bearing, spelled with a K, Konkave, and after he came out with the diff pads, that was 2002, early 2002. Late 2002, he created a yo-yo called the Wide Load, and it was a beast. I think it was like with the rings in it, it was like 70 grams. And he was saying, if you want it unresponsive, just play with it as is. If you want it responsive, put some lube in it. So like that was sort of that fix of like, that's how you tweaked it. You didn't change the gap. You just put more or less lube in it. But either way, it was still designed for responsive. I reached out to Frank and I asked him, did you make an unresponsive yo-yo? Did you make the first unresponsive yo-yo? And I'm going to read you his thing here. What I remember in late 2001, 2002, when I started making yo-yos, is most, if not all yo-yos had a thin bearing and thin gaps. Lubing the bearing was a common to help response. Then around 2003, Yoyojam came out with the C-size bearing. Before that, I used a thin bearing with a groove in the center to keep the string from rubbing to the side of the yo-yo, but I also switched to the C-size at that time because of Yoyojam. And I also put a groove in the center of them too. But that didn't work well because the wider bearing, the groove trapped the string in the center and the response suffered. And that is when I came up with the concave bearing, so the string would be centered but could still move to the side when needed for response. And after that, many players started using dry, unlubed bearings for longer spin, but that also made the yo-yo very unresponsive. So in my mind, someone out there came up with how to bind the yo-yo to return, and I just followed suit by using dry, unlubed concave bearings. So I think it's pretty much a coincidence that I might have had anything to do with unresponsive play and binding. Pretty much he's saying the same thing I said about Beefcakes, except he's saying he doesn't think the wide load is the first unresponsive yo-yo out there. And that's from him. And I tend to agree. I think he's coming from the same place that a lot of us were. We were just pushing how much unresponsive could still qualify as a yo-yo. It could still technically yo. So, you know, I have another guess in terms of what I think could be, you know, the first official bind return only yo-yo. But Connor, do you want to tell us, like, do you have any thoughts on what you think it might be?
I was also thinking about Diffio at the time, back when Frank was really getting into the scene. And I remember back when, like, the wide load and the Sportster came out, he was also working with a guy in Michigan named Willie Terrain. And this guy was an innovator back in the day. And he just came up with all sorts of crazy tricks and had all of these insane ideas that just panned out so well. And he was a player that was way ahead of his time. And he actually came back a few years ago, and I got to talk to him, show him some stuff, and see what he could do again. And his ideas still held up, even though he was 15 years out of the game. So, like, this man was that far ahead of his time. And so Willie Terrain was the guy who inspired me. Okay, look into Frank Diffio and look at these Diffio yo-yos, and okay, here's a wide load, here's a Sportster. And so my first metal yo-yo was a Sportster, and it had a C bearing, but at the time, the best we had was the Duncan stickers, which are for A bearings. So when you think about the A bearing versus the C bearing, like, the outer race is, you know, that much for A and this much for C. So that meant, like, you had to, like, take an X-Acto knife and, like, carve out the friction sticker so that way it would fit around the thing, right? And then after a couple days, that Duncan sticker would wear out. There was no other yo-yo sticker on the market, period, right? And so, like, that was the only thing we had. And back when things wore out and it was just, like, you know, the adhesive with the cloth on the Duncan sticker was like, well, that's now unresponsive, basically, when you're at that point, into the wear and tear of a Duncan sticker. And also with the fact that, like, you're carving out half of the Duncan sticker to get it to fit around the bearing made it even less responsive. And so I remember ordering something else from Frank, like an extra concave bearing or something like that from him directly. And then in around 2002, he included in the package, go ahead and try out this new thing that I have called a diff pad. And that was like, oh, okay, so it's a different material. It's not quite the cloth, but it's a little bit more grippy. And then it was also carved out well enough to fit into the C bearing perfectly without having to, like, you know, take a knife to it or, you know, take some cutting tool to it to make it fit. And so that was, like, my first experience seeing an unresponsive yo-yo be done with, like, a design where it was intended to still make it work as an unresponsive. I remember I didn't like it at the time because I'm like, it doesn't come back up. Like, what am I supposed to do, right? And so, like, that was, for me, my like, oh, that is, like, the first thing where I'm like, oh, so a manufacturer or a person out there is, like, thinking about this unresponsive thing, kind of. But to summarize it all, like, we can, like, I guess we can tag, like, everything as official and unofficial, but really, when we think about it, it's just been one big giant gradual accident that unresponsive and binds have really happened over the course of, you know, the early years in the early 2000s, I think.
when I was thinking about this question a lot too, just for thinking of like, okay, like what were some of like really when was my first experience with a yo-yo that was meant to be completely unresponsive? And one experience that came to mind, I want to say it was either end of 2002 or early 2003. I came across a store which is long gone now. This was back in Maui, in Hawaii, and they had this huge yo-yo display. They had a lot of like Omega stuff, but they also had this display case of like nicer yo-yos. They had like a bunch of Yoyojam stuff, and I remember I tried out one of the yo-yos that was in the display case, and I think it was a Buzz-on Bushido actually. I'm not sure if it was Bushido or Element X. It was one or the other, I remember. But I remember that was a brand new yo-yo that like they took out of the package, let me try, and that first throw immediately like it was not coming back up. It was completely unresponsive. And I remember telling him, I was like, "Oh, this yo-yo is really like is everything okay?" And the guy was like, "Yeah, you just need to." And he showed me like oh, this yo-yo is unresponsive. You got to just bind. And as far as I can recall, that was like the earliest I can really remember like a production yo-yo. So not like a modified yo-yo, anything else. Like it was brand new out of the package, and it wasn't able to come back. You had to do a bind to get that yo-yo return. I'm thinking back, I'm pretty sure that was a Bushido. I can't remember exactly what year the Bushido came out, but I believe it was.
I can help you out there.
Okay.
Yeah, because I was surfing Wayback Machine today, the Internet Archive. I was looking at all the old edits on wiki pages and all the old versions of yoyoguy.com. I got on extremespin.com, and December 2003, the Buzz-on Bushido was listed, and I have scrolled back all throughout that year. The Bushido in December 2003 was the very first time that I could find that Extreme Spin used the term bind return only. And so the Element X, which came out earlier, was basically, I think the Bushido was an Element X with more weight. It was 72 freaking grams. So it was like more weight, but it was also the Element X insides, which were really cool, almost like a mod. And so like they were like these add-ons to a plastic yo-yo, and the Bushido came with one pad. So it's kind of hacky, right? It's not like it was a first recessed thing. It was like literally an Element X, take off one pad, it's unresponsive now. But I think just based on what I could find today, and you know what you're saying is kind of making me feel a little more confident. December 2003, the Buzz-on Bushido was the first yo-yo sold as an unresponsive yo-yo, and you can look at the Element X, which is almost the same yo-yo, and you can see they're not using that term until the Bushido comes out. So it seems like that's an intentional difference between the two.
Yeah, I remember my Element X's back in the day, like coming out responsive out of the box, and like the only times in which like I felt like the Element X could work as an unresponsive was when you put an SPR kit in there, and like at that point, like the div pad with the SPR kit would have came out, and like they would have an A bearing version, a C bearing version. And once you put the SPR kit, then anything Buzz-on could be unresponsive.
Was the Bushido not SPR?
It came out not SPR, but then like the SPR kit, I remember like coming out a ways after that.
Yeah.
And then once that came about, then it was like, oh, okay, so this Bushido thing, there might be something here to it. I wonder if we can make our other yo-yos work like that too. I think like the real reason SPR came out was because Buzz-on had a lot of like vibe issues. Everybody remembers them as like, oh, like people complain about vibe now, but back in the day, we used to call things as vibe and wobble. And like yo-yos back in the day would vibe, but then Buzz-ons would wobble.
Yeah, Buzz-ons would wobble to the point that they would turn into a sphere, like
and a ring would fall out.
And so, like the SPR kit was meant to, like, oh, okay, let's. As soon as we put that in, they're like, okay, now instead of it wobbling, it's vibing, and now we can, start to work with it. So, like, I remember the SPR kit was doing that, and once like you get the wobble to turn to a vibe, then like the pads won't get as close to the string anymore, right? And so it would start to become a little less responsive because of that.
Connor, I know it's getting late. You're going to be doing street performing soon. I want to kind of wrap up what I think we've learned. I don't think we have consensus on much. Oh God. Okay, here we go. I think Clay Murray was the first documented 1A bind in 2000. in the How to Be a Player video, and the differentiator that we're saying here is not just that it's a backspin bind, which it happened to be, but that it looks very intentional. It doesn't look like a happy accident, where some of the other recordings seem to be sort of a last ditch or whatever. They seem to just kind of work, and it works.
Yeah, I like the fact that that it looks like Clay Murray was premeditated with doing that. Like, he intended to go into that undermount to make a bind happen. Whereas, like, say, the Kick and Tricks video, like, he happened to be in that gunslinger and tried to pull it back. And it's like, he didn't, like, do a maneuver where I could tell, okay, yep, he's doing it with intent. So I like to think it's got to be Clay Murray because he premeditated the concept and then executed it in the video. So I think that's where I would give it credit.
As far as the first player to use a bind in a freestyle, I'm thinking it was Coda or Black, but I'm thinking, from what I'm hearing, people are saying Coda was doing it maybe even before this, but in terms of documentation, Coda at the UTYJ yo-yo competition in 2001.
Yeah, I feel pretty confident with that. I mean, I know that you were saying that Black also had done a bind kind of at that same point. And honestly, like, the two of them could have, like, actually discovered it separate from each other. It's hard to say, but yeah, I'd say, like, most likely Coda is gonna be the winner here.
Yeah, I haven't reached out to Black to ask his thought, but from what I'm hearing, Coda was sort of the one that everyone was like, he made this up and he's teaching it to us, and we call it the Puchan. And so it seems like Black probably just kind of learned it and was integrating it. Now, I do want to say, I did hear from Coda. I did reach out to Coda about this, and Coda didn't say he was the first. He seemed pretty happy that, people were saying he was definitely early on. But Coda did say that he was a member of Team Offstring. Hironori Mi, who we talked about earlier, 1998, won a second place champion, binding an offstring yo-yo. Well, it makes sense that an offstring player would be one of the first people, because that's kind of what I think we all wanted, was some of this connection. And it sounds like Coda told me directly that he was doing offstring, and so when he moved to single A, he was just like, oh, a bind is what you do. I learned it from this. I'm just going to move it to that. So, Coda was the first probably to do it in freestyle, and Coda definitely got it from Offstring as an inspiration. Going back to John Gates, which goes back to Dale Oliver, but Clay Murray, we're thinking, still predates that by a year. And as far as mods, no one gives a crap about mods. So as far as first unresponsive yo-yo, I'm feeling pretty solid about Buzz-On Bushido, December 2003, being the first one marketed, at least on Extreme Spin.
I think that's our eating spaghetti of this video. I have a feeling there's going to be a comment down below, and someone's going to give us a 2002 example that all three of us are going to be like,
yeah,
yeah.
Like, I feel that's the one that's coming.
Yeah. Someone's going to be like, oh, there was this novelty yo-yo that was intentionally made to stay at the bottom of the string. But unless you knew the secret to get it back up. But other than that, like, Connor, are you feeling pretty good about, because I think Josh and I are both kind of thinking Buzz-On Bushido might be the first unresponsive marketed yo-yo?
Yeah, I got nothing that even resembles or could top that, and if I had to guess, I'm going with that too. So right. That I felt was an unresponsive yo-yo. I do remember playing with it back in the day, and it felt like it was meant to be unresponsive. It felt intentional, and so I'm gonna agree with that until several weeks from now when we all read the comments down below and we see that one example.
Yeah.
Thank you, Spencer Berry, by the way, for the apology and the correction.
Josh, what are you trying to say there?
Oh, this is a Bushido.
A Bushido. All right. The one thing, this is the thing that we're going to get comments on, so I'm gonna just address this. A lot of folks say Yoyojam, and they'll say the Minimoto, or they'll say whatever. I'm going to call BS on that because it's not part of their marketing. Those were the first yo-yos that were super easy to mod. Like silicone, I did a tutorial on how to mod your bolts, 2004, maybe, I don't know, maybe sooner. But like Those are super easy to mod, but they were intentionally made to be responsive. And as well as like they would sell you shims, they would sell you things, but they didn't make a yo-yo for unresponsive before the buzz on Bushido. And I don't know what their first yo-yo you could call. Like I'd say the Hitman was still dual O-ring or whatever. So I don't know when they finally kind of embraced it. But even though they were used by bind return players, they weren't making them specifically with bind return in mind. They were always selling them with the idea that when you tugged it, it came back up. So,
like even with the Hitman, like it would come out of the package, and people may not remember, like the Hitman was an adjustable gap, and you had to shim it back when it first came out. And so, like when it came out of the box, it was fully screwed together, like to its smallest gap setting, and then those O-rings were in there. Protruding out really far. So, I mean, that thing came back pretty snappy when it came out of the box.
Yeah, I was going to say even a lot of those, like, you know, that the mid-era of Yoyojam, you know, like the Hitman, into like the X-Convict, Black Knight, etc. Like all those yo-yos, like even the Speeder, like they were still tug responsive when you got them. You would, if you took it right out of the box and you just went for a throw immediately, like, yeah, they were tug responsive still. And I can't actually think when they kind of stopped doing that. There definitely was a turning point, I feel. But most of the, as people kind of call them, like the golden era of Yoyojam yo-yos, they were still tug responsive.
Yeah, I remember like the Dark Magic was kind of bridging that, where it was like because Dark Magic was half Starburst, half O-ring, or we called it hybrid response back then. And like that was the first time where I'm like, okay, I played with a new Dark Magic for 5 minutes, and it's like, oh, I gotta like tug it pretty good to get it to come back up. Okay. And it's like, the more you played with it, like several hours.
Oh, wow. We lost Connor at just the...
Oh, no.
Well, that's I think a great spot to wrap up on. I will say that I've done an interview with John Gates about the creation of Single A, as well as Tape Measure and a whole bunch of other like strong influence that he's had in the yo-yo community and top the ring community. That'll be up later this month, so that's not up yet. But if you really want to get into that deep dive of the first binds, probably that would be a good place to get started. But I think this is a great exploration. This was way more work than I expected. I want to say a huge shout out to Chris Neff, Ray Irakawa, Koda Watanabe, Greg Cohen, Ben from Yo-Yo Factory, Jeff Coombs. There are so many people who gave us information for this episode that was just mind-blowing and crucial. And this was a huge collective thing. Thank you to Connor and thank you to Josh for joining me. I'm going to put links up to your names. I'm going to put links in the description below so people can find you and you know, follow you. Thank you so much for doing this. I do want to say I hope we can do more of these. I want to do a deep dive into the history of 2A yo-yos. I think that would be super fun. I mean, Yoyojam has some crazy 2A yo-yos that I don't think anybody ever talks about. We have so many things we can talk about. So I hope y'all will join me again for this. And one more time, shout out to my sponsors on patreon.com/DocPop. These videos take a long time to produce, and you know, they help make this possible. So huge shout out to John Anderson and Taka from Spin Gear and all the rest of my sponsors over on patreon.com. Thanks, Josh, Connor. It's been great chatting with y'all. Have a great night.
Thanks, Doc.
Thanks, Doc.